I'm sorry, Pa, I couldn't hold the line. The old man drops to his knees in the dirt, hands blackened by ash, the sky behind him glowing orange. Flames devour the southern half of his wheat field. A legacy planted by his grandfather during the Great Depression, now reduced to smoke in the dark. Behind him, his wife screams his name, but he doesn't answer. Not yet. Because for the first time in his life, Walter Green feels defeated. By fire, by greed, by the system that promised to protect people like him. And just as he lowers his head, a sound cuts through the night. Thump, thump, thump. He looks up. A shadow breaks through the smoke. An Apache helicopter. Searchlights blaze. Sirens wail from the distant road, and everything changes. If that gave you chills, hit that like button. Drop a comment. Would you hold the line if everything you love was under fire? Subscribe for more powerful, cinematic stories like this. Keep watching, because what happens after the fire will stay with you long after the credits roll. Walter Green woke before the sun, as he always did. Not because of habit, or age, or pain in the knees, though he had all three. He woke because the land called him. It always did. He pushed open the weathered wooden door of the farmhouse, the creak sounding like a whisper from the past. Before stepping out, he paused and looked at the framed photo on the wall. His grandfather, in suspenders and a dusty hat, standing next to a horse-drawn plough. Behind him, a field much like this one. Beneath the photo were words handwritten in faded ink. The land feeds us. We protect it in return. Walter adjusted his own hat and stepped into the morning light. The Green family had worked this land since 1904. His grandfather had broken the earth during the Dust Bowl, when clouds of topsoil swallowed the sky and men sold their last chickens just to buy flour. His father had planted wheat through war rations and fuel shortages, and Walter, he had never left it. To outsiders, it was just wheat. Dirt. Corners of America no one remembered unless it was in crisis. But to Walter, the Green Valley fields were sacred ground. Every stalk of wheat carried the memory of survival. It wasn't just food, it was defiance, it was legacy. That morning, he ran his hand over the heads of wheat. They were nearly ready, tall, golden, full. Despite the chaos of the world beyond the fence, the crop had thrived. But for how much longer? Helen, his wife of 48 years, stood on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. Her grey hair caught the wind like silk. "You slept even less than usual," she said gently. Walter took the mug, stared into the dark liquid. Dreamt of my grandfather again. Helen didn't need to ask which dream. It was always the same. The day they lost 3 cousins to starvation. The day government trucks dropped sacks of flour that lasted only a week. The way Walter's grandfather had pointed to the earth and said, "As long as we have this, we survive. The moment we lose it, we're just dust in someone else's storm." Later that day, the black SUV rolled up the gravel path like a vulture. A young man in a tailored suit stepped out, smiling like a dentist, before drilling. He held a sleek tablet in one hand and a contract in the other. "Mr. Green," he began, "we've spoken before. Novacore Technologies is offering well above market value." "Not interested," Walter said, without waiting for the rest. "Sir, with all due respect, this is no longer a personal decision. This land is part of a region that's been zoned for critical research infrastructure. Your refusal is delaying." Walter turned away. The young man raised his voice. "Do you realize what you're holding back? You're standing in the way of progress." Walter didn't look back. "You're standing on graves." That night, Walter sat alone on the porch. The stars were clear, no moon, just a deep black sky and wind whistling low. He heard coyotes in the distance. The wheat rustled like whispers. Helen joined him quietly, placing a blanket over his shoulders. She didn't say anything for a while. Finally, she asked, "Do you ever wonder if it's time to let go?" Walter shook his head slowly. "If I sell, it means none of it mattered. Everything we protected, everything we survived, all of it erased by a signature." Helen held his hand. "Then we don't sign." The next day, it began. He found his irrigation lines slashed. The old tractor, untouched for years, now had its oil drained. A dead crow nailed to the barn door. And then, An envelope without return address. Sell now or watch it all burn. He said nothing to Helen, just fixed what he could and moved on. But every night he slept lighter. He kept the old shotgun closer. He stopped leaving the porch light off. A week later, the first fire came. It started in the northern plot, 2 acres of wheat torched in the night. The fire department claimed it was accidental. Dry grass, lightning strike, but Walter knew better. No clouds, no rain, no reason. He stood in the ashes the next morning, boots blackened, hands trembling. Helen watched from the porch, tears in her eyes. "How long can we keep doing this?" she asked. Walter looked at her, and for the first time in 50 years, he didn't have an answer. But he couldn't let go. He spent the next day posting signs around the property. Private land, heritage farm, protected under agricultural acts. He called the sheriff, who shrugged. "Hard to prove anything, Walt. Could have been kids, could have been heat. You know how it gets." But Walter knew, and Novacore knew too. That evening, a girl pulled into the dirt road in a dusty Subaru. She had a camera in her hand and curiosity in her eyes. "I'm Maya," she said. "Tatoka. I do stories on endangered farms. Saw something about your place online." Walter narrowed his eyes. "Not interested in influencers." Maya laughed. "Good. I'm not interested in followers, just truth." Walter didn't trust easily, but there was something in her voice, something raw and angry, like a younger version of himself. He let her stay. She filmed the ashes, the scorched wheat, the signs, the boots. She asked about his grandfather, about the depression, about why he stayed. When she left, she looked back and said, "If they burn this field, I promise the whole world will know." Walter didn't expect much. He never did, but that night Maya's video went live, and by morning it had 1.2 million views. They used to call it Green Valley for a reason. The land had once been quilted with small family farms, barns with red paint chipped by the seasons, windmills turning slowly in the prairie wind. The kind of place where Sunday potlucks meant something and neighbors came running if your tractor stalled in the field. Now most of it was quiet. Too quiet. Walter drove down County Road 7 in his old Ford pickup, passing house after house that no longer belonged to families. Each mailbox stood like a tombstone, names scraped off, metal posts bent, forgotten. A wind carried the scent of char and chemical dust. He stopped in front of the Redding farm, at least what used to be. Only a cement slab remained, surrounded by plastic fencing marked Novacore, future site of Green Tech Bio Research Campus. Future, that was the word they kept using, like everything before them was dead. In less than 2 years, Novacore had bought out 27 farms. They'd started slow, polite conversations, offers that sounded generous. Then came the pressure, regulatory inspections, utility cutoffs, zoning challenges. Mysterious fires, quiet threats, smiles with knives behind them. Walter remembered the day the Wilsons sold. Old Pete Wilson had tears in his eyes, holding the deed like it was a gravestone. They'd buried 3 generations of farmers that day, not with a funeral, but with a fountain pen. Walter hadn't gone to say goodbye. He couldn't. He was too angry, too ashamed that he understood. That afternoon, the Novacore rep returned. Not the young man this time, a woman, mid-40s, hair in a tight bun, dark blue suit, clipboard in hand. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Green," she said, standing just outside the gate. "I'm Dana Sorensen, legal counsel with Novacore. I'm here to formally present our final offer." Walter didn't speak. He leaned against the fence post, arms crossed, eyes steady. She opened the folder. $8.4 million, tax-free. Immediate wire transfer, plus we'll include a relocation package for you and your wife, a new home, medical coverage for life, and honorary naming rights to one of our research wings. He raised an eyebrow. "You mean I get my name on a wall in exchange for 118 years of blood and wheat?" She blinked, then shifted. "We're building something bigger here, a future. We're curing soil degradation, creating sustainable synthetic crops. Feeding the world, Mr. Green." Walter laughed, once dry and bitter. "You think the world needs another lab? It needs roots, real ones, the kind that don't wash away with rain and press releases." She took a breath. The smile vanished. I'm going to be honest. If you refuse again, our hands are tied. The state will rezone the land under emergency agricultural repurposing. You'll be evicted, you'll lose everything, and we won't be able to protect what's left. Walter didn't flinch, but inside something twisted. Is that a threat? It's a process, she said coldly, and processes don't care about stories. After she left, Walter stood at the edge of the southern field, where wheat still danced under the breeze like nothing had changed. But everything had. The land was surrounded now, choked on all sides. His was the only field still alive, still growing. That night, he dug out a box from the old trunk in the attic. Inside were handwritten letters from his grandfather, passed down to his father, then to him. One caught his eye. There will come a time when men in suits will come for what's ours. They won't wear chains, they'll bring contracts, smiles, promises. But when they stand on this soil, remember, this land didn't survive the Great Depression to be sold like stock. It grew us. It fed soldiers. It fed our neighbors. When they offer gold, you offer silence. When they offer silence, you offer roots. Walter folded the letter and put it in his jacket pocket. By morning, the rumors were true. Novacor had begun placing pressure on the county board to declare his property non-compliant with state land use policy. The sheriff came by, not as a friend, not really as an enemy, just tired. Walt, they're calling it a biosecurity risk zone. Something about unregulated crop strains. You and I both know it's bull, but they're playing by rules we can't touch. Walter nodded. Let them come. The sheriff paused. You sure about that? You could still take the deal, move out clean. Walter turned away. This place doesn't move, and neither do I. The next day, Helen found a man walking along their eastern boundary with a tablet, scanning the soil. She called out, "Can I help you?" He looked up, startled. "Just doing soil analysis for regional integration." "No one invited you," she said sharply. He shrugged. "I don't need to be invited. It's public perimeter now." That night, Walter built a new fence. Not to keep things in, but to make a statement. This land still has a line. Meanwhile, Maya's video continued climbing. By the end of the week, it hit 5 million views. Hashtags spread like wildfire. Hashtag Greenfield, hashtag Don't Burn the Roots, hashtag Land. Its life students from agricultural colleges began reposting it. Veterans commented about how fields like Walter's reminded them of the land they fought for. Mothers tagged it as a lesson in schools. It wasn't just a field anymore. It was a symbol, Novacor noticed. And the next day, Walter's internet went dark. It had been 3 days since Walter's internet went dark. No signal, no Wi-Fi, no explanation. He'd called the service provider from Helen's old flip phone. They told him there were network upgrades in progress and that rural coverage would resume shortly. But Walter knew that voice, too polished, too polite, like it had been trained to smile while lying. The silence wasn't natural. It was strategic. "They want to cut me off," he muttered, pouring 2 cups of black coffee. "Isolate me, make me feel small." Helen took her mug, leaned against the sink. "You're not small, Walt. You're the last tree standing in a forest they burned." He looked out the window. Then they'll come with axes next. Walter's routine didn't change. He still walked the fields every morning, still checked the wheat, still listened for the sounds that weren't supposed to be there, but now there was something else in the air. A tension, like static before lightning. He found footprints near the shed, fresh ones, not his, not Helen's. He found the barn door slightly ajar when he knew he'd locked it. And one night, Helen swore she saw red lights blinking through the wheat, like eyes hiding just beyond the rows. That same week, Maya returned. She didn't knock this time. She pulled up, opened the hatch of her car, and carried out a box of printed screenshots, USB drives, and a stack of photos. "Can't trust cloud storage anymore," she said, smiling grimly. "They've started flagging all my uploads as aggressively political content." Walter raised an eyebrow. "That even mean anything?" Maya sat on the porch steps. "It means I'm getting close." She laid out everything she'd found on the table between them. Photos of the fires, thermal maps showing Novacor's private drone flights. A leaked internal memo titled Priority Clearance, Green Parcel, Fire Protocol Contingency. Walter stared at the printout. They planned this. Maya nodded, and they're getting desperate. Because your video, it didn't just go viral, it made the news in DC. There's a congressman looking into rural land acquisitions now, the heat's building. Helen came outside, holding a tray of lemonade like she always had for guests, though her hands shook more now. They're watching us, she said. A sedan with tinted windows has passed our driveway 4 times today. Never stops, just circles. Maya didn't flinch. That's okay, let them circle. The more they push, the more people pay attention. What they don't realize is, your story doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to everyone who still believes land means something. Walter looked at her. You sound like my grandfather, she smiled. Then he was a wise man. That night, Walter sat in the barn alone, candle flickering beside a small wooden box. Inside were medals, letters, an old uniform folded tight. The past sealed in fabric and ink. He held a photo of his father in one hand, dressed in army green, standing next to a Chinook in Korea. Dad used to say this field taught him more discipline than basic training ever could, he whispered. His hand hovered over the rotary phone on the wall. Dusty, cold, outdated, but it still worked. And that night, he used it. The next morning, Walter rose with the sun. A different energy coursed through him. He trimmed the overgrown grass along the entrance, repainted the old fence, fixed the broken porch light. Then he planted a new sign at the edge of the road. Active Military Training Ground, Essen, 1942. Unauthorized access is a federal offense. It was more symbolic than legal, but it felt right. He didn't expect a response, but one came. 2 nights later, the phone rang. Not the cell, not the line Helen sometimes used for pharmacy calls. The rotary. Walter picked it up, expecting static. Instead, he heard a voice, crisp and commanding. Mr. Green, please hold for General Hawkins. His breath caught. I'm sorry, what? This is Sergeant Cole with the Pentagon Liaison Office. General Hawkins read a recent brief including your name. He'd like to speak with you directly. Seconds passed, then another voice, calm, older, edged with iron. Mr. Green, the general said, I saw the footage, the fire, the sign, the history. Walter sat down hard on the stool beside the phone. You're calling about a sign? No, Hawkins said, I'm calling about service, and the fact that you've been providing it for decades, unofficially. We used Green Valley during emergency drills back in the Cold War. It was never decommissioned in our older records. I'd like to come take a look. May I? Walter's throat tightened. He nodded, though the general couldn't see it. Yes, sir, you may. When Walter hung up, Helen walked in, holding a dish towel. Everything okay? He smiled for the first time in days. You ever hear of General Hawkins? Helen squinted. Name sounds familiar. Walter leaned back. He's coming to visit. She blinked. Who is? He pointed toward the ceiling. The cavalry. The morning after the phone call, Walter stood in the kitchen for a long time, just staring at the rotary phone. It hadn't rung again. There was no confirmation, no paperwork, no convoy of support, just a voice in the night and a promise that could vanish like smoke. Helen placed a fresh mug of coffee on the counter beside him. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Walter finally looked up. If they're coming, they're not in a hurry. By noon, the mailbox had been ripped from the post. A clean, sharp break, too precise for weather, too deliberate for accident. Walter fixed it in silence, drove a new post into the ground. He didn't curse, didn't call the sheriff. He'd stopped expecting help from the county weeks ago. Instead, he did what his father taught him, repair it and move on. But as he hammered the post into the soil, he noticed something across the road. A drone, small, quiet, hovering no more than 10 feet off the ground. Its lens tilted toward him like an unblinking eye. Walter stood straight, stared at it, didn't flinch. The drone hovered a few seconds longer, then rose vertically, vanishing into the blue. Maya came back that afternoon. She was different now. Not just a Totoka chasing stories, there was a fire behind her eyes. "They've flagged 3 more of my videos," she said. "My page was suspended for 48 hours. Accused of spreading geopolitical misinformation." Helen brought lemonade, but Maya barely touched it. Her laptop sat open on the porch table, playing a loop of thermal imaging clips she'd sourced anonymously. "These are from a former environmental analyst who used to work for a Novacore subcontractor. He claims the fires weren't accidents. They were tactical burns, controlled, timed, and monitored by private security teams." Walter narrowed his eyes. "That legal?" Maya scoffed. "It's not about legal, it's about leverage." That night, the sky was unusually clear, stars like pinholes in velvet. But Walter couldn't sleep. Not with the wind whispering too loud, not with the scent of smoke always seeming closer than it should have been. He walked the fields again, flashlight low. Everything looked fine. Still, something in the air felt wrong. As he passed the old scarecrow in the center field, he stopped dead. The scarecrow's head was gone. In its place, a plastic jug filled with ash, hanging by twine, swinging slightly in the wind. Walter didn't touch it. He just turned, walked back to the house, and locked every door. By morning, Maya was gone. No warning, no note. Her car wasn't in the driveway. Her tent was packed up. Her digital trail wiped clean. Helen found a single USB drive on the porch swing, taped to the underside of the armrest. Walter plugged it into the old laptop inside. It contained one file, a video. Footage opens. Night vision view of a black SUV parked along the county road. 2 men exit. One carries a small gasoline container. They move toward a wheat field. The timestamp reads 2:13 a.m. They pour. They walk away. A match flickers. Then, ignition. The flames burst upward, controlled, methodical. Walter's hands gripped the edge of the table so tight his knuckles turned white. Helen was trembling. He looked at her. "They're preparing for something." She nodded slowly. "They're testing how close they can get before we scream." 2 days passed without incident. Then came the white vans, 3 of them, no logos, parked on the road for hours. Men in khakis and sunglasses stood beside them, arms crossed, saying nothing. Walter called the sheriff, the same one who used to eat pie in Helen's kitchen during the fair. "They're not breaking the law," the sheriff said. "It's a public road." Walter clenched the phone tighter. "They're staging, you know it." "I know you're a good man," the sheriff said quietly, "but I can't protect you from shadows." Walter hung up. That night, he did something he hadn't done in decades. He walked into the barn, past the tractors and seed bins, and climbed the wooden ladder to the hayloft. From beneath a tarp, he pulled an old metal chest. Inside, a dusty radio. Military issue, analog. He tuned it to a frequency he hadn't used since his father died, just static. He didn't speak, just left it on. Letting it listen. Maybe someone was still out there, maybe not. The next morning, Walter found a new sign staked into his front gate. Not from him. White background, black letters. Decontamination zone, entry restricted. Stamped beneath it, Novacore Biosecurity Division. He ripped it down with shaking hands. Helen came outside, saw the rage in his face. "Walt," he turned to her, "they're going to do it." "Do what?" He looked at the horizon. Burn everything. The war shifted. It no longer wore boots or carried flames. It didn't sneak through fields at night or hover in silence like drones above a barn. Now it wore suits, delivered through satellite feeds and headlines, and it moved faster than fire. Walter sat in the living room with Helen as the local evening news broadcasted the segment. The anchor's voice was sterile, but the message was unmistakable. New reports from Novacore's Environmental Safety Division suggest Green Valley has shown signs of aggressive soil pathogens. If not treated immediately, it could risk cross-contamination to nearby agricultural zones. "Bull," Walter muttered. Helen clutched her tea. "They're setting the stage." The screen flashed images of Novacore workers in hazmat suits walking through scorched fields. Not Walter's, of course, but close enough to blur the line. And that's what they were doing. Blurring truth into suggestion. The next morning, the town paper ran a front-page op-ed. "Why One Man's Stubbornness Could Cost Us Our Agricultural Future," by Dana Sorensen, Nova Corps Public Relations Lead. Walter read every word. The article painted him as a nostalgic obstructionist, clinging to outdated values, standing in the way of scientific progress and public safety. No mention of the fires, no mention of drones, no mention of heritage. Just an elderly landowner refusing to comply with modern standards of sustainability. Below the article was a poll. Should Green Valley be placed under emergency state supervision? Yes, 73%, no, 27%. Walter folded the paper in half, laid it gently on the kitchen table, and stared at the wall in silence. Maya was still gone. No calls, no uploads. Her page on Tutok was now replaced with a blank white screen that read, "This account has been permanently suspended due to multiple violations of platform standards." Walter tried calling the contact she left on the USB drive. Disconnected. All she left behind was her footage, and it was no longer enough. That afternoon, a man in a grey windbreaker arrived at the front gate. He didn't approach, just stood there, holding a cardboard box, his eyes hidden by sunglasses. Walter stepped out onto the porch. "You lost?" The man raised the box. "This is for you." He placed it on the ground and walked away without another word. Inside the box, leaflets. Dozens of them. Each printed in glossy color, showing Walter's face overlaid with grainy black and white images of diseased crops and biohazard signs. The headline read, "Misinformation has consequences. Protect our future. Reject green." Walter stared at the pamphlet in his hand. They weren't just silencing him now. They were erasing him. By nightfall, a second SUV parked across the road. This one didn't leave. Helen drew the curtains without saying a word. Walter took the shotgun from the wall and leaned it by the door. Not because he planned to use it, but because he needed it to be seen. He sat on the porch in the dark, under a moonless sky, the only light coming from the old lantern above his head. The field swayed gently, unaware of the crosshairs drawn around it. And then, the hum returned. Not from the sky, but from the barn, a faint mechanical whirring. Walter stood, heart racing, and walked toward the sound. He entered the barn cautiously, flipping on the light switch. Nothing. Until he turned to the far stall. There, in the hay, buried under an old tarp, was the military radio. Still on, still tuned to that same forgotten frequency, still broadcasting static, but now faintly, beneath the white noise, something else. A pulse. Not words, not voices. 3 short bursts. One long, one short. Walter froze. Morse code. He didn't remember much from his father's lessons, but this one he knew. "Stand by." He ran to the house, breath short. Helen looked up as he entered. "They're listening," he said. Her eyes widened. "The military?" He nodded slowly. "Or what's left of it that still remembers this place." He didn't sleep that night. Neither did she. At dawn, new trucks rolled into town. Nova Corps vans, full of contractors, not scientists. They set up temporary fencing just outside Walter's southern border. No one came to the door, no one asked permission. On the fence, a banner, "Authorized Containment Zone. Entry restricted per State Code 81.4C. Walter approached the site. A man in a hard hat and headset intercepted him. "Stay back, sir, for your safety." "This is my land," Walter said, voice low. "Not according to our latest topographic acquisition," the man replied. Walter took a step forward. The man didn't flinch, but 4 others subtly adjusted their posture. One hand dropped near a baton. Walter backed away. He stood in the center of his field that night. No moon, no wind, no sounds. He looked up at the stars, then down at the earth he'd spent his whole life tending. He knelt, pressed his palm into the soil, then whispered, "They'll burn this too. Not just the truth, not just the paper, not just the girl." He closed his eyes. "They'll burn the earth, to salt." The wheat had started to bend under its own weight. It was that time, just days from harvest, when the crop leaned not from weakness, but from fullness. A season's worth of sun, water, and will had brought it to life. And Walter watched it all, like a man watching his child sleep before surgery, knowing something irreversible loomed ahead. Every morning he walked the borders with a rifle slung over his back, not to use it, but to wear it. It was the only kind of language Nova Corps seemed to understand. The fencing crews returned. This time, they didn't even try to look official. Construction hats, military-style boots, earpieces. They moved like hired muscle, not technicians. One of them stared Walter down as he walked the northern line. Walter stared back. The man smiled. Inside the house, Helen had grown quieter. Her hands trembled more, but she tried not to let him see. She still made coffee, still set out breakfast, even if neither of them touched it. Still folded the same checkered dish towels, like routine could keep the world from unraveling. But that morning, she spoke what had been sitting in the air for days. "What if we're wrong?" she whispered. "What if holding on doesn't save anything?" Walter didn't answer right away. He sat across from her, stared at his hands that once could lift a full hay bale without thinking, now stained with dirt and doubt. "If we give in now," he said finally, "they win not just the land, they win the story." Helen's eyes filled with tears. "But if we lose everything." Walter reached across the table, held her hand. "Then let it be said we didn't give it for free." That night, someone left a dead chicken at their front steps. Its neck twisted, body covered in engine oil. Next to it, a matchbook from a gas station an hour away. Written inside, "Fire spreads fast, you should too." Helen vomited when she saw it. Walter buried the chicken without a word. The radio still hummed softly in the barn, same frequency, same static, same occasional Morse bursts, but the tone had changed, more frequent, more urgent, 3 short, 2 long, pause, repeat. Helen asked him if he knew what it meant. Walter didn't answer. He didn't want to tell her it meant, hold but prepare. 2 days later, a letter arrived, delivered by hand, no postage, no sender. Walter opened it in the barn alone. Effective immediately, your land is under provisional observation for biohazard risk mitigation. Failure to vacate within 72 hours may result in escalation of containment protocol. Nova Corps Security Division. That night, Helen packed a bag. Not because she wanted to leave, but because she needed to believe they could, if it came to that. Walter watched her fold clothes she hadn't worn in years. She looked up at him, tears in her voice. "We should go, Walt. We can fight this from the outside." Walter said nothing, just walked out the door and back into the fields. As midnight approached, the wind picked up. Not the gentle prairie kind, but sharp, erratic gusts, like breath held too long finally being released. Walter stood in the middle of the south field, surrounded by gold. He touched a stalk, brittle in his hand, ready for harvest, or for burning. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in weeks, he prayed. Not to win, not for revenge, but for meaning. In a house 400 miles away, a former Nova Corps employee clicked send. The message went to a dozen journalists, an agricultural watchdog group, and a pair of environmental attorneys. Attached was a folder. Project Blackroot, Internal Protocol for Land Clearance by Controlled Fire. Each file was time-stamped. Each action aligned with Walter's recent burns. Each document outlined how to create media cover stories. It was a match to the gasoline trail leading straight to Green Valley. But the email sat in spam folders, buried, ignored. Because Nova Corps had already gotten ahead of it. The next morning, Helen found Walter sleeping on the porch swing. Or at least, trying to. His eyes were open, blank. She sat beside him, wrapped his coat tighter around his shoulders. "We can still leave," she said softly. He didn't answer. His voice, when it finally came, was hoarse. "They've already lit the match." And she knew he was right. Because across the field, a black SUV idled on the ridge, its engine off, windows up. But Helen swore she saw something glowing inside, like firelight reflected in glass. The wind changed at 2:11 a.m. Walter noticed it first, not because it was loud, but because it wasn't. For weeks, the wind had groaned with tension, always blowing east to west. But tonight, it had stopped. No wind, no insects, no sound at all, only stillness. He sat on the porch swing, cradling a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. His eyes were fixed on the horizon. There was nothing there, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Helen had fallen asleep on the couch inside, curled beneath the same quilt her mother once made during the war. Walter had offered to take the bedroom, but she refused. "I want to be close to the front door," she said. He didn't ask why. They both knew. Then came the glow. Not bright, not sudden, just a flicker, like a cigarette lit in the dark, only it didn't die out. Walter stood, heart already sinking. The glow pulsed once, then spread, and then he smelled it. Smoke. He ran. By the time he reached the south field, the flames had already begun to feed. Rows of wheat snapped and curled into glowing embers. The fire moved fast, faster than he'd ever seen. It leapt from row to row like it had been waiting for permission. It wasn't an accident. This was precision. Someone had mapped it. He stared into the fire, blinking back tears not from grief, but from heat. "No!" he shouted into the night. "Not like this!" He grabbed a shovel from the shed and began to dig a trench between burning and unburned rows, his body shaking from the effort. But the fire wasn't listening. It didn't care about legacy, or names, or sacrifice. It only knew how to consume. Walter dropped the shovel. His knees gave way. He collapsed onto the scorched earth, hands blackened, eyes stinging. The sound of fire filled everything now. Crackling, snapping, roaring like a beast that had finally been let loose. The smoke curled around him like a hand. He coughed. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "I'm sorry, Pa, I couldn't hold the line." Behind him, Helen screamed, not from fear, from heartbreak. She ran barefoot across the yard toward him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. They didn't speak. There were no words left to say. Only fire, and then a vibration, faint at first, then stronger, then louder. Walter lifted his head. The flames still danced in front of him, but now the sound had changed. Thump, thump, thump. Not fire, not wind, rotors. He looked up. Through the smoke, a shape emerged. Sharp, black, unmistakable. Apache. It hovered low, just above the southern ridge, slicing through the haze like a warbird resurrected from a forgotten era. Its spotlight clicked on, cutting a beam through the chaos, illuminating the worst of the blaze. Then, another vibration, this one from the road. Sirens, multiple, red and white lights flickered on the horizon, bouncing off the smoke in ghostly pulses. Fire engines, coming fast. The Apache circled once, then tilted. A soldier leaned out the side hatch, not to shoot, not to threaten, but to drop something, a small crate. It landed a few yards from Walter with a hard thud. The Apache didn't leave. It hovered, watching, guarding. Walter crawled toward the crate. On its side, stenciled in white, USF, Field Response Unit 93rd. He pried it open. Inside, fire blankets, radio flares, a hand radio, and a laminated map. A red circle marked his land. Across the top, in all caps, Temporary Defense Zone, Code Grey initiated. Helen helped him to his feet. He staggered slightly but steadied himself. From the road, the fire trucks finally reached the property, water cannons already primed. Firefighters leapt from the vehicles without hesitation, charging into the blaze. Walter turned back to the Apache, still hovering silently above. He raised a trembling hand. The spotlight on the chopper flickered once, acknowledgement. Then it rose, higher, slower this time, and disappeared into the black. The blaze was brought under control by sunrise. Half the field was gone, but the other half stood tall, wet from the hoses, still golden despite the ash. Walter walked the edge of the burned line. The contrast was brutal, black earth to the left, glowing wheat to the right. A border of survival. Helen joined him. "Why now?" she asked. "Why show up tonight?" Walter held the laminated map. "They were listening," he said softly. "This whole time." He paused. "And tonight, they chose to answer." By mid-morning, news vans began arriving. Not from the county, from the coast. One of them wore a press badge with Maya's name. But it wasn't her. A younger man stepped out. He walked up to Walter, nervous. "She asked me to take her place," he said quietly. "She's in hiding, but she didn't give up." Walter said nothing, just looked back at the half-burned field, then down at his hands, still blackened, still shaking, but no longer empty. Walter stood at the fence line, boots buried in soft ash. The field before him looked like a battlefield, and in many ways it was. A war not of bullets or bombs, but of land and legacy. Half his harvest had been turned to soot, But the other half still stood. Helen approached, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. She didn't say anything at first. The silence between them was heavier now, but not empty. It was filled with everything they had survived together. "They came," she said at last. Walter nodded. "They came," he echoed, "but not to take." News of the Apache's arrival and the emergency fire response had spread like, fire. Clips circulated across every platform, from Tutok to primetime news. The footage of Walter kneeling in the flames, the chopper descending, the sirens screaming in from the darkness, it all became a symbol, not just of resistance, but of dignity. "Sir." "Hold the line," cried Greenfield, rising. "What?" Fire missed. The nation had its new icon. But Walter, he had decisions to make. 3 days later, the sky over Green Valley was blue again. Ash had settled. The burned rose had stopped smoking. The military crate still sat unopened on the porch, though Walter had read the contents a dozen times. Temporary Defense Zone, Tactical Response Authority, Code Grey Clearance. It sounded impressive, but Walter didn't want titles. He wanted peace. That evening, a letter arrived, not from Nova Corps, from Washington, official, sealed, and signed by someone who used to wear stars on their collar. Inside was a request, a formal proposal to designate Green Valley as a federal agricultural heritage site, protected under National Defense and Conservation Acts. It came with offers, funding for restoration, scholarships in Walter's name, media rights, a small on-site museum, and even a documentary team from PBS. Helen read the letter out loud at the kitchen table, then folded it carefully. Walter sat back in his chair, stared at the ceiling for a long moment, then said, "They want to make a monument out of a fight we never asked for." Helen smiled. That's usually how monuments start. The next morning, Walter walked the property with a cane now, not out of weakness, but as a reminder. Each step was slower, more deliberate. The field felt different underfoot. He could still smell the scorch in the soil, but he could also see new green pushing through the edge of the burn. The land wasn't giving up. Neither would he. That afternoon, a familiar voice returned. The rotary phone rang. Once, twice, then a third time. Walter picked up. "Mr. Green," the voice said. "This is General Hawkins. I understand you've had a few visitors." Walter chuckled. "You could say that. We're grateful for what you did, what you preserved. The department is prepared to offer formal military stewardship for the land." Walter paused. "I'm tired of being preserved, General. I want to grow again." There was a long silence. Then the general said, "Then grow. But you won't be alone." That weekend, Walter called a meeting. Neighbors, old friends, university students, local reporters, and a few soldiers from the Apache crew all gathered in the barn. Maya even joined, through a live stream. Her face was pixelated from the encryption, but her voice was steady. "I couldn't stay silent," she said. "What they burned wasn't just wheat. It was memory. But what they couldn't burn was purpose." Applause filled the rafters. Walter stepped forward. "I don't want to be remembered as the man who almost lost his land," he said. "I want to be part of what comes next." He pointed toward the field. "We rebuild, together." 6 months later, Green Valley was reborn. The scorched hearth became a living classroom. Agricultural students visited each season to study regeneration. Veterans planted trees. Children learned to seed and harvest with their bare hands. A single path cut through the field, half charred, half blooming, left untouched as a reminder. At its end, a stone marker. They tried to burn the future, but the roots remembered where to rise. Walter no longer walked the field alone. His grandson, Caleb, now 19, wore a wide-brim hat like his great-grandfather once did. He was the one who handled the tractors now, the irrigation, the soil checks. Walter just watched, sometimes from the porch, sometimes from under the shade of the rebuilt barn, sometimes with Helen's hand in his. And on the last day of harvest, as the valley glowed gold once more, a sound returned to the sky. Thump, thump, thump. Everyone looked up. The Apache, not to fight, just to fly. Walter stood as it passed overhead, slower this time, respectful. One of the crew leaned out and waved. Walter lifted his hand. This time he smiled, not in defiance, but in peace. They called it the Field of Honor now. It wasn't Walter's idea. It came from a 7-year-old girl during a school tour who, after hearing the story, asked her teacher, "Is this where the heroes grow the food?" The name stuck, and somehow it felt right. 12 months had passed since the fire. The line between the burned and unburned halves was still visible, though now it was intentional, maintained, preserved. A living scar that reminded every visitor what had been fought for and what almost wasn't saved. The new barn stood taller than the old one, not because it needed to, but because it symbolized something larger now. Green Valley had become more than a farm. It had become a message. Every season brought new life. Caleb ran things now, still awkward with his hat, still getting used to the weight of responsibility. But he had fire in his blood, same as his grandfather. He'd studied soil science at the university, but his real education came from sitting beside Walter on quiet mornings, learning how to read the land the old way. Walter no longer worked the field, he walked it, with a cane in one hand and the other always brushing the wheat like he was saying hello to old friends. He wasn't the owner anymore. He was the keeper of the memory. In the spring, they planted a new crop, one they'd never tried before. Sunflowers. Caleb had suggested it, said they'd enrich the soil after the burn, and Walter agreed. But what neither of them expected was how the community reacted. Within weeks, word spread. People came from towns over, then counties, then states. Not for the flowers, but for what they stood for. Rows upon rows of yellow heads stretched toward the sun, rising from the very place someone once tried to destroy. Every Saturday, the Field of Honor held open tours. Veterans spoke under the oak tree near the fence. Students took soil samples and recorded data for climate programs. Families walked barefoot on the recovery path, children learning how roots don't give up just because the ground gets hard. And always, at the end of the path, they stopped at the stone marker. They tried to burn the future, but the roots remembered where to rise. Some cried, some prayed. Some just stood still, listening to the wind move through the wheat. One afternoon, Walter received a letter from Maya. Still in hiding, still moving between safe places, but still watching. She'd seen the footage from a Tutok livestream. Asi samketisi. Caleb talking to a group of high schoolers about regenerative agriculture. In the letter she wrote, they tried to silence a field, but now it speaks louder than all their buildings. Walter read it aloud to Helen that evening. Her eyes shimmered, same way they had the night he told her he wasn't going to run. She should come back, Helen whispered. Walter looked at the fields beyond the window. She will, he said, when she's ready. One morning, early July, a military convoy stopped by. Not for a show, not for protection, just to say thank you. A colonel stepped out, shook Walter's hand, and handed him a small wooden plaque. It read, "To Walter Green, for holding the line, for reminding us that land is not just soil, but soul." Walter didn't say much. He just nodded and whispered, "I was never alone." The colonel smiled. "No. And now none of us are." The final harvest of the year was the most beautiful Green Valley had ever seen. Golden wheat, towering sunflowers, even the burned soil yielded wildflowers, blues and purples peeking through like healing skin. And in the sky, the Apache. Not every day, just once. On the anniversary of the fire, it flew low, made one pass over the field, then tipped its wings gently, left, then right. A salute. Caleb looked at Walter, then back to the sky. They didn't forget. Walter smiled. "No, son, and neither will we." At night, after the visitors left and the porch light flickered on, Walter sat alone for a while. He ran his thumb along the edge of the cane, feeling every dent, every crack. Then he stood slowly and walked the path to the center of the field. He didn't bring a flashlight. The moon was enough, and when he got there, where the fire had burned the hottest, he knelt down and placed something in the dirt. A small envelope. Inside, a copy of Maya's letter. And a photo. His grandfather, his father, himself, Caleb, 4 generations, one line, he buried it beneath a sunflower. Then stood and smiled. And so, the fire didn't win. The field still stands, not because Walter Green was a hero in the headlines, but because he believed in something so old. It became new again, so rooted even fire couldn't erase it. But this story isn't just about one man. It's about all of us, holding the line when everything pushes us to let go. So let me ask you, what would you do if they tried to burn your legacy? If this story moved you, tap that like button. What part hit you the hardest? Drop a comment. I read every single one. And if you believe stories like this should be told, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Because sometimes one voice, one field, is all it takes to remind us some roots were never meant to die.